complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about it blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
If you share my lack of faith in our health system, you should take control of your well-being. Building resilience and maintaining good health for the long term needs to be a priority. Axios Remote Fitness Coaching offers one-stop expert advice on training, diet, and lifestyle. You can purchase customized workout plans for strength training or structured exercise. If you're serious about maximizing your potential, you can book time with a coach or customize your routine and get video feedback on your performance. I know the owner, and he's one of us. Visit Axios and support those who support the show. Follow the link in the description to become a man of action with Axios. No one blames you for being weak, but it's your fault if you stay that way. All right, Luthemplaer, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing, man?
Test. Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Am I alive? Okay, I was dead for like a second there. Okay, I'm doing well. Hopefully the internet is doing better than me. Or I am doing as good. Hopefully I'm not doing as good as my internet.
Well, fair enough. As is, I think it's one of the bingo squares, right? The Jay Burden Show has run into numerous technical issues. Some of which are entirely your fault, and actually I'm going to blame all of them on you for mysterious socio-ethnic reasons. But yeah, I moved to a new place, and the Wi-Fi is not up to snuff. I am getting a tenth the speed I got in my old place, but hopefully we'll be fixing that soon. Anyway, I'm glad to have you back, man.
You did the proper Christian thing and moved to a new place after you got married?
Oh yeah, 100%. Neither of us had lived there before, and so it's not bad.
Good
it's
ethics.
Just, you know, it's a bit of a change, you know, getting married and moving all at once. Not bad, just, you know, a lot of work.
Yeah.
All right. So we're not just here to for me to insult you for bad internet. We're actually here to do what we do often, which is read an interesting article from your Substack. I was telling you earlier today that you actually have my favorite Substack. And it's not just because, you know, we're friends, but it's because I genuinely have no idea what you're going to talk about next. And so do you want to introduce kind of the piece that we're going to talk about tonight?
Yeah, so Eunocracy, right? I did one show with that with I think Dimes, which is pretty cool. I don't know if it's up yet, but that was pretty fun. But we didn't quite get into some of the topics, which hopefully we'll be able to get to here. But yeah, that was part of one of my. Sometimes I just get obsessed with a word, and I do like a deep dive of where it goes, and I end up like going to the New York Public Library into the archives where I can find it. I've often said the best thing about having gone to an Ivy League school access to a lot of archives, and I just like I could spend my entire life as an archive research person if I wanted to. Don't want to because it's kind of lame, but I could.
Yeah, and that's something that I genuinely didn't realize, that even at kind of like a shitty public school, that the amount of access you have in a library just with a basic student ID is actually insane. And so I kind of only realized that at the very tail end of my career in college. And so, yeah, I can imagine being in like a big metro area. You just have access to, you know, texts that you can't get anywhere else.
Yeah, ironically, texts that are like from like British publications, like I go into here, but like it's genuinely amazing how much you can get out of it.
All right. So I'm going to launch into this. And as you guys can probably hear, Luthemplaer and I are working off a little bit of a delay. So we'll have to essentially work off of walkie-talkie rules, where there'll be a little bit of a gap after I'm done talking, just for him to realize I'm done talking. And so if you hear that, that's what's going on, and we're going to try to avoid talking over each other if we can. So all right, I'm going to launch in. There exists a Chinese phrase which deserves some writing about. Not that you, dear reader, have never heard of it. You most certainly have. The phrase is moon runes, and as you may have guessed from the title, this phrase is usually translated as eunuch system. While there are alternatives to both the Chinese and English, the purpose of this article is more so to investigate a specific English translation of that phrase that I recently stumbled upon. John Key a rather well-expected British non-academic historian on the matters of the Orient offers a different translation. Just to eschew any doubts to his abilities, it's worth noting that he's known for and has won awards for his many articles at The Economist, The Guardian, The Independent, and has an impressive biography of Oriental topics. An impressive bibliography of Oriental topics. So at the very least, his having offered an alternative translation ought to be considered and not cast away without thought. It was his peculiar translation of the phrase that caught my attention and led to this post after all. And that translation is eunocracy.
Yes, and we'll probably skip ahead because it's a long article. But sorry, I just switched to my phone Wi-Fi. Hopefully it's a lot better.
Yeah, it sounds good to me.
Okay, yeah, there's like no delay. Awesome. Nice to know that the... Anyway, yeah, so this is one of those terms where I remember stumbling upon this term like years ago from one of Keir's books, Keir or Keen, I can't remember his name. I remember reading one of his books years ago, and the word stuck in my memory, and now I can't remember what triggered the memory to remember it, but I stumbled upon it again, and I was like, I should do a Substack article about this, because really, at the core of it, it's describing not just a eunuch system, but a specific time period in a eunuch-based system when it switches from functional to dysfunctional. He chose this term for essentially late-stage eunuchs. China is famous for its eunuchs, imperial era. China is famous for its eunuchs because, when you're in China and you have 8,000 years of history, you have a tendency to lose the throne to a competing dynasty. And how do you get competing dynasties? They develop alternative infrastructure, institutions, and managements that at some point become better than the imperial model, and then they become the new imperial model. And so at some point, the emperors got clever, and they thought, well, if that's the case, I'm just going to replace my top guys with eunuchs who can't actually make dynasties. Kind of a clever immune response to competition, but, eunuchs can only get you so far. Eventually, when, previously where the ruling dynasty in the... let me pause there. Are you familiar with the Heavenly Mandate? And maybe we should say that before we... in case the audience isn't familiar?
Well, yeah, and you may be referencing to the most idiotic YouTube comment I've ever received, which was a rather long rant about the word, the mandate of heaven. But that might not be something in common use. So could you explain the concept of the mandate of heaven?
Yeah. So when you're an 8,000-year-old civilization, you start to know certain patterns in how your civilization operates. And in China, they noticed that there was a pattern that, for a few centuries, there would be a ruling dynasty. That dynasty would rise because of chance, circumstance, and just everything seems to align for them. So they would call that the heavenly favor, where things just go for them. And then once they're in power, they were viewed as having received this like mandate of heaven, that being this command to take the realms of power and govern China well. And eventually, the Chinese dynasty would they would become corrupted by the very thing that they were using, and they would eventually grow to gain the wrath of heaven, and that would cause them to lose the heavenly mandate, and thus a new dynastic cycle would arise where heaven would choose a new dynasty to replace the old dynasty. And so in China, they always had this idea that history isn't linearly improving, it's cyclical with the rising and falling of dynasties. And to some degree, once this became popular opinion, it became a self-reinforcing system. Somewhere along the line there, the emperors got concerned about how can they lengthen their dynasties between eras, and so they started using a system of eunuchs to weed out competing dynasties, because if the competing dynasties don't have the opportunities to prove themselves, then heaven can't choose them, right? It's just like kind of like attempt to control heaven. There's a lot of biblical imagery in there too, I gotta say. But the eunuch system worked for a while, but over time, it itself proved to be a stumbling block in the sense that, let's say you're in the old model where you're a competing dynasty. As the emperor gets more incompetent, your dynasty, gradually grows in power, and it just kind of happens that you take over. It's usually a violent war, but it's never too bad. With eunuchs running the show, that power dynamic can't operate because now the competing dynasty is a dead end, right? They can't found dynasties because they don't got the parts to do it. And so once the eunuch realizes that their lord is on the downside of things, and there's a good chance that you're going to live to see his downfall, which means you're probably going to get murdered with him when his downfall happens, that essentially puts a giant clock on your consciousness. I'm going to live to see myself murdered. And if you kind of know you're going to get killed, why shouldn't you take more than you should and just party hardy until the end, right? You kind of reinforce the corruption and ultimately end up accelerating the downfall. And this process of eunuchs aware that their time is limited, both literally because they can't pass on themselves to an heir, and figuratively in the sense that the dynasty is coming to an end, they become some of the most god-awful people you've ever seen. If you scroll down further, there's probably a quote there that you can read. Scroll a little bit more. Oh, I don't think the am I still on?
Yes, you are.
Okay, sorry. I can't see anything moving on the image. Is it still live?
Yeah, it should be. So what I'm seeing is there's a pull quote talking about tax collectors. Is that what you want,
Yes,
or do you want something?
that's it. You can read it if you want.
Sure.
It's not showing up on the screen, unfortunately, but
The
maybe
tax collectors found gold mines, not in the mountains, but in the rich cities. If they were told that a rich man lived here or there, they said he had a silver mine in his house and immediately decided to ransack and undermine his home. Sometimes, in order to secure an exemption from being robbed, cities and even the provinces bartered with the eunuchs and paid them a large sum of silver, which they said was taken from the mines of the royal treasury. The result of this unusual spoliation was an increase in the price of all commodities, with a corresponding growth in the general spread of poverty. So what this reminds me of, and what I think is interesting in this, is that there's kind of a double-edged sword when it comes to the eunuch, right? Because on one hand, the desire to have servants who are not kind of eyeing you up to replace, your line with theirs, that's a benefit. That's kind of a force multiplier. But on the other end, it's like, well, much like you said, if they've got nothing to live for, really, outside of like the here and now, it's kind of this like, and it reminds me very much of what Thomas says about the pointless society. When there's kind of like nothing outside of this like one genetic dead end. It's like, yeah, sure, why not, burn the house down to keep yourself warm.
yeah, and so I like the quote finally showed up on the screen. This is a really good quote to really express what it is that happens to eunuchs when they're near the end. And I say this is like a product of a eunuch. It's really a product of human nature when it's under these circumstances. When a human knows that there are, whenever my sister is freaking out about the world coming to an end, I always like sit down and tell her, listen, if you know you're on the Titanic and you know the future, you might as well enjoy the wine because it's not like anyone's going to stop you.
Well, right, yeah, and there is like, I think that this is one of the advantages of having, and maybe this is like a hyper Calvinist take on it, but one of the advantages of having kind of like a spiritual vision for the world, right? Kind of like an order to the universe, is that like you can kind of find something darkly funny in how badly the world is going. It's like, well, God picked me, so I don't know. I'll be fine.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a whole separate line of discussion.
Yeah, that's more Calvinist thinking. But it is it's one of those unfortunate things of human nature where something about it's really hard to resist the urge to take more than you should when no one's going to stop you, and no one's going to stop you, and that like there's nothing going to happen, because then it's just like you're really just like under no security. And in many ways, the people that don't take more than they should, those people end up being virtuous, and they oftentimes end up being the people that then are the ones starting the next dynasty. In many ways, the meme of China's like ultra-violent civil wars that kill like tens of millions of people every couple of hundred years, it comes from this system, because that's basically what's happening. Past the meme, this is what's happening. The eunuchs are taking too much. Everyone's suffering, and eventually there's a boiling point. And because there's no actual alternative dynasty allowed, they kind of have to prove themselves through superior military and morality. And sometimes that means punishing an entire city that's been like sucking your countryside dry, and then you get a really violent situation. I guess we can go on forward past. Oh, sorry. Go on.
Sure. I'm going to read these 2 paragraphs because they kind of answer, 2 objections people may be raising. One thing is I can hear my audio ever so slightly on your end. So
Okay, I'll
I'm
mute
just going to,
yep.
if you could. Perfect. Thanks. All right. Note here also that in such late stage dynastic decline, the eunuch begins to tear off from the rest of the imperial bureaucracy. Lords and scholars, who by themselves constitute a local bureaucracy with potent men, become victims of unrestrained eunuchs seeking to cannibalize local wealth for their own comforts. This change of form from a local eunuch system to a roving brand of looting lords deserves its own word. It is this late stage cannibalism which I wish to define as eunocracy. The choice to both manufacture and employ a professional class of eunuchs is not unique to China. It should be noted, nor is the nature of this double-edged sword. Such castre professionnel existed in the Ottoman Empire as well. Likewise, when the goings got hard, the emerging eunuchratic mess oft tore members off the Sultan's domains, most famously the Mamelukes, forming an independent Egypt. You may also be familiar with biblical examples in Babylon and Persia. While Daniel is never outright said to be a eunuch, he neither marries nor is stated as having children. It was normal for Babylon and Persia to make eunuchs of foreign elite and place them in seats of authority, of which Daniel's recorded life seems to match rather perfectly. In fact, one may consider 2 Kings 2:18 to be direct reference of Daniel, but it is clear it's not known for sure. Daniel did not live in an era of decline, other than Israel's, so he spent his years serving the emperor faithfully and likely bequeathed the Magi with the prophecy of Christ's birth, hence their precedence in the New Testament. Daniel would not fit the description of eunuchrat. Okay, so there was a lot in that. So there are several things, right, which is that this is not, unique to, the Chinese system. It seems to be kind of a pattern in human affairs. And there's something to be said, right, for these kind of like impotent elite, where the system of politics, court intrigue becomes your whole life. There's kind of nothing to distract you. And I think it's interesting how you make the distinction between, a functioning eunuchratic or eunuch class and what you consider, eunuchratic. So is there anything from those paragraphs you want to go into, Luthemplaer?
Yeah, it's not much, but like it does kind of explain the difference because yes, it is. I kind of wanted to emphasize the difference between a functioning eunuch system or class and a non-functional one, in order to like kind of show that we're entering a non-functioning one. And you made the clever choice there to like mention like inept or what was the word, inept elite.
Mm-hmm. I can't remember. I say so many things. I can't remember what I say.
Well, they're emasculated elite, where they can never, they're a kind of person that can never exist in any other time period, basically. And as that starts to grow, you're gonna see them start to take more and more. This is probably the first time a eunuchratic class has formed with make-believe money, and so there is a question of, is there a limit to how much they can take when the money doesn't even matter, right? I have some theories about that, but I'll bring them up later on. Anyway, we can move on if you want.
Well, I think it's interesting to bring up, right, that this is not a purely negative, like, social construct, right? Like, it works for a little bit. And I think that's good to realize, right? Because, and you and I realize both have, complicated feelings on Darwin, right? But there is something to be said for the fact that if a cultural adaptation is a pure negative, right, it wouldn't be repeated so often in civilizations. But it does kind of seem like and I know maybe you've seen the meme, right? Or maybe you made it, who knows? Where it's Bart Simpson in the front of class. And it's like, all right, my show and tell is the eunuch class, and the joke is the teacher says, Bart, that's the 9th time this millennium that you've brought out the eunuch class, right? Like, it's a relatively common occurrence, and it does have, at least ideally, right, kind of a function, right? Not necessarily a moral one, but nonetheless an effective one, I guess.
Yeah, Prude promised to send me that meme, but he never did. But yeah, I heard about the meme. I know the meme format. It's not Simpson. It's Jimmy Neutron.
Oh, you're right. It's
But anyway.
well, forgive me. My ability to describe memes isn't exactly top.
At this point, I think I probably switch gears into trying to like broaden the perspectives of not just like literal eunuchs, but like figurative eunuchs in the sense of like inept elite. There's a word that you're using, not inept. It's a different word. I'm just gonna say emasculated, but like these kind of like leaders that could never exist in any other time period, and probably are aware that their time to rule is limited. And so they tend to just say shit that isn't true and do shit that's ridiculous. And then, oh, where did this mob of people come to arrest me? Oh, I guess I did something wrong. Yeah, no shit.
So in this next paragraph, and I don't want anyone to use these streams as a substitute for reading the article, right? This is kind of a guided discussion using the article. So I'm skipping over things that you should go back through. It's linked in the description. You should check it out as well as his Substack. So this next paragraph are basically describing the other uses of this word. It hasn't been used often. There's kind of a circle of, British academics, many still living. I think it's 3 of them, who've all used this word. They write in the same papers. They probably know each other. But
yeah, sorry, I just want to say, yeah, this I like finding words like this that are rare, and then once you find out who's using them and they're all working in the same place, you can kind of like you accidentally become the fly on the wall. I know what you guys are discussing. I know what you're doing. Haha. But to some degree, it does allow you to add in a coherent voice to their discussions. Even in this case, where it's like 50 years later, and all these guys are either dead or like too old to talk about stuff. Pickles. Oh yeah, that was a fun. I do have my zingers. Thank you very much.
There is something to be said for that fact that like you can sort of, and this is a really like douchey chin stroking phrase, but you can kind of like map out the memes, like in the older sense of that word, right? Like you can kind of track, even if indirectly, kind of who is in conversation with each other. I feel like it's the like white hat version of what like the ADL or like some like awful like DNC funded NGO does, when they like kind of find who our friends are talking to.
Yeah, and the thing is, we don't do that enough to our foes. Like, if you track out like when words are first used and what people use them and what meetings they were going to at the time, you can start to see how power flows a lot more easily. Like, you can find a evangelical conference that happens and they use a few zing words, and then if you look at the pastors that visited, they all use those buzzwords within the next 3 months, and like, okay, you're just copy pasting. It makes me view the pastor as dim-witted copy paster, not actually that creative. B, it makes me realize that it only takes one subversive in those gatherings to infect an entire denomination, which oftentimes is what happens, where you might have an example where Peter Drucker, the old economic guy, invents a word like purpose-driven, and then Rick Warren takes that word and brings it to an evangelical conference, and then every evangelical pastor for the next 10 years is using purpose-driven life directly from an economic secular perspective, which this actually was done by Pirate Christian Radio, who now hates me, even though I still like his old blogging, but he did do some good research back in the day on how these. I learned how to do this from a man that now hates me on Twitter and wants me dead. But anyway,
I try not to get into inside baseball too much, but one of the genuinely weirdest experiences about being on the internet is when you make the crossover and now you're interacting with someone that you know or was like impactful to you. And
yes.
Like that's kind of cool. Like the
yes.
positive version of that is me and the distributist.
Yes.
The negative version is that where it's like
when I went hiking with the distributist I think a year ago, it was very surreal. It's like I'm with the person that drew me back to Catholicism and has inspired a large amount of how I speak and talk, and now I'm hiking with them in the woods.
Right, that's positive. And then there's the negative side, which is like Red Letter Media getting like cursed out by William Shatner on
yes.
Twitter,
yes.
or like Me getting blocked by
Yeah.
Rod Dreher. It's like retarded stuff like that, but nonetheless, it is like
These
wait a minute,
titans.
this is-
I mean, not to get that's the other article I wrote that you were DMing me your weeping feelings about, but that's for another time.
yeah, that's for another stream, right? Okay, so on to the next paragraph. The article, linked here, details much of the impotency of Trump's picks for various offices. Of course, the power held by Trump's higher-up, like Sessions or any of Biden's today, is not a sphere of influence which happens overnight. It is the product of an authority-holding jurisdiction rewarding its loyal base. The problem detailed by Lord Blacks generally come about by picking bad allies at the start of a bid for power, not during an exercise of acquired power. As mentioned before, let us differentiate between the eunuchs and the ordinary bureaucrats. We can imagine a bureaucrat as someone with political ambitions and potency, who represents a potentially competing dynasty. The eunuchrat is a dead end. He simply lacks the ability to muster competing dynasty, and is instead interested in cannibalizing what he has been given by an authority figure. It is often the case that a man of authority will first achieve a great conquest thanks to the service of his potent inner circle. However, that potency quickly becomes a threat in peacetime. Immediately, some of the secondaries will start to grow jealous of the vast domains of their lord and demand shares as reward for having helped this authority figure achieve their great victory, at which point history can diverge in several directions. All right, so there are several things which that brings up in my mind. And this is really the reason I wanted to have you on. Oh, yeah, no worries. But to me, this reminds me of several things I cite often, right? Which is, on one hand, my favorite circle of hell in Dante's Inferno, right? The world's most depressing comedy, where essentially, right, he describes usurers and sodomites as having the same punishment, which of course he basically did the Chad, Yes, and Soy Jack version of his day by basically drawing all of the people he didn't like, roasting in hell.
Yeah.
But the way that he describes both sodomites, right, which is the medieval term for someone who had non-procreative sex, I'll put it that way, and the usurer, someone who makes money out of money, is he describes them endlessly dragging plows around a desert, right, tilling infertile land. And to me, that's an interesting way to look at it, right? That in a weird way, sexual impotency is linked to, those two sins. But also in a weird way, you could almost imagine the eunuchs in the same circle of hell. That they're sort of tilling in infertile ground, if you sense my drift.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, that's a product of the sexual revolution too. But there is this idea of I try to, whenever I try to deal with these kind of maze and mess of words, I try to assign them characters that you can visualize to try and help memorize it. So in this case, I had authority figure, bureaucrat, and eunuchrat, and that's just the kind of the pyramid I drew to help visualize the different terms. These words may have meaning elsewhere. I'm just using it in this way. Anyway, I'm not sure if there's anything specific you want to ask about that. I kind of zoned out for a second.
No, that's fair. And I think that this is also interesting, right? Because it reminds me very much of the reason you don't want, or the reason authority doesn't want competent people. And I think that we kind of pat ourselves on the back, when we look at the spiteful mutants that the regime is, promoting. Right? Because they're oh, look at them. They're sacrificing capable, competent people so that they can have loyalty. But the problem is, and I think that this is something we all need to realize, is that one of the reasons the left and the right are not symmetrical is that in general the right is made up of people who have better things to do than politics. Which is that generally when you kind of pride yourself on hierarchy and capability, right? People who have those traits tend to not need politics as badly. And I think you see this in the asymmetry with kind of American party politics over the last 50, 70 years, right? Where if you look at, the right wing in America, their line was always just leave me alone. Just leave me alone. And some of that's weakness, right? But some of that is also genuinely those people want to be left alone, right? Politics is kind of not their prime, their prime, I guess, end in life. They have a family, they have religion. And you know me, look, I'm not trying to like lionize Republicans, far from it. But I do think that there's something to the fact that like when you take away someone's options, when politics is all they have, right? That's the front half, the non-catabolic stage of the eunocracy. You can get a crazy amount of loyalty from that. And the example I always think about is the alphabet people, right? People of the letters have been, shall we say, historically marginalized in most societies, right? It was not particularly comfortable to be a sodomite, right? To use Dante's language. And now, right, when we essentially have AIDS and any number of other STDs, right? You're literally hooked up both politically and in many cases medically to the system. So that means you're loyal to the system, right? Like if you're on PrEP, right? If you're receiving government subsidized AIDS medication, quite literally, if the government doesn't provide healthcare, you're going to die. And you don't have kids normally, unless you've stolen someone's kids. You are both indebted to the system of power, literally on a biological level, but also on kind of like a political and social one. And I think that this is very much that kind of idea of, bio-Leninism, that Spandrel talks about all the time. And to me, I just think it's an interesting connection that in a weird way, it's like, well, say what you will about our enemies, but they're loyal. They're just loyal to something evil.
Yeah, I make this point a lot when I see people angry at progressives. I make the point that the progressive is just the modern peasant, and you can't fault a peasant for being loyal. That's a virtue. You have to be angry at the lord that he's loyal to because he's not being virtuous. So place your anger in the right place. Never be angry at a progressive for being loyal to their lord. That's just virtue misapplied. They're actually quite virtuous. They're very loyal to their lords. They're not going to rebel. That is a virtue. It's just the problem is they have the wrong lord. And understanding that can help you like ease off on a lot of your anger that you might have as a right winger. Because there's really no reason to be angry at a peasant because his lord's in power. That's like a stupid way to apply your anger. You're not going to get anywhere doing that. You should be angry that the lord that is currently in power is there and think about how can I be a better lord that these peasants will follow me instead. Once you start thinking like that, now you're starting to become an aristocrat, basically.
well, and there's something to that, right? And you see this a lot with kind of the anger, and I'm speaking delicately on this issue. You have to forgive me, but the anger towards shall we say like the regime's client classes, right? Yeah, you can fill that out on your own. And in a weird way, people are mad because those people have extra license that you and I don't have, right? They can do things that you and I couldn't without receiving punishment. They get direct compensation in any number of ways. And to get mad at them is sort of you're sort of charging the flag and not the bullfighter, right? And in a weird way, in doing so, you sort of reinforce the client relationship, the client-patron relationship.
Yeah. And sorry to cut you off, but like you have to, no offense, but you, dear out of power white boy, have to start viewing the black guy as your government's knights because that's how they function. You may not like that. You may be angry about that, but that's how they function. That is the function of the hierarchy. And no matter how much times people want to yell about equality and progress, it's still a feudal state. You live in a feudal state. That's the knight class. That's the privileged class. They get to be knights. You don't. You're the peasant. So figure out how to be a knight or stop being angry because a knight is loyal to his lord. That's just the way the world works.
Well, and there's something that, because I got married and over my honeymoon spent time in New England, right? In kind of the area that was burned out, in the Second Great Awakening, right? I'll put more detail to that. And it's interesting because it's one of the most secular places, in the continental U.S., right? But that religious fervor never went away, right? Just got transferred into politics in many ways. And to me, there's just something that I can't stop thinking about where it's like these people are these people are kind of acting out very human urges, right? Like you talked about, like the peasant is loyal. But there's something kind of ghastly about the degree to which like day-to-day politics has become, kind of like the focus of life. And I think that the spread of the eunuch class from being kind of like a strata of society to actually like quite a large cross section of society, when you consider the fact that, okay, obviously, there's a certain percentage of people who are quite literally, removing their wedding tackle, right? That's a very easy analogy. But also, it's like, well, okay, like functionally, are you, and I'm not talking about you, Luthemplaer, are you any different from a eunuch? If you are in big city, working big job, you know, getting on in life, hitting that kind of like biological wall, right? And now you're not literally biologically a eunuch, but you're not having kids. You're not going to have kids. You're fully and totally enmeshed in the system. And so in a weird way, right? Like this eunocracy is growing, well past, I believe that you said in the Ming dynasty, right? There were 70, 80,000 eunuchs, right? Which is a lot of people. But in a weird way, it's kind of like grown well outside the bond of what it would be in kind of like a normal society. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, and you make a good bridge because I don't think I worded very well the shift from literal eunuch to spiritual eunuch, but you just did it really well. In terms of like, if you're functioning like that caste, you are a member of that caste, whether you like it or not. There is in many ways here a kind of weird warping of the reality because you have to ask, is the managerial class middle class person in the city that's not having kids, are they a peasant or are they a eunuch, or are they kind of both in terms of how they function? I don't know. Technology kind of blurs the lines here because in some sense they're still managers and their peasants are kind of out in work from home or other office sites and stuff like that. I don't know. In some ways, they're kind of like this new caste, which is why we sometimes call them managerial class, because they're kind of a new thing that kind of doubles up as both peasant and noble, or eunuch in this case. It's hard to I don't quite have a word for it, and so we just use I prefer using manager. The managers are their own thing that kind of overlaps eunuch and peasant.
Well, and it's sort of why, and I realize it might be overly simplistic, but I kind of think that the core metric, right, that kind of divides politics right now, there obviously is to some degree, a racial component. There's some degree a class component. But really it comes down to, who is a client and who's not. And I see what you mean, that at the same time it's like, well, okay, like, the managerial class, they are a client class, right? They receive benefit. But they're in a client class in a very, very different way, than the people who are, receiving EBT, right? They're both receiving something from the state, but in a very different way. And I think that it's easy to look at it, because maybe you are Luthemplaer, but I am very much not a client of the state. They've made it very clear that they do not prefer me and my opinions.
Yeah. I was gonna say I'm the one here, over 30, childless, working in the city. I'm unfortunately being fed into the eunuch class, or what Spengler would say, the IQ shredder. I'm trying to get out of it. Really am. I really wish I could. But in many ways, like, although in some sense that what they offer is going down, right? Like they don't offer the same packages that they used to. Like my dad, he grew up in the Vietnam era, and he got partially drafted for a bit. He got drafted right when Nixon shut down the draft, so he was in training and then left when he was allowed to, so he never had to go. And he went to work for the city in New York City, and he got a package deal where You work for the city for 30 years, and he was like 18, so you know 30 years you'll be like 48 basically, not even 50. 30 years you work for the city, you get a pension, health care, and basically enough money to live off of for the rest of your life. So once you turn 48, you'll never have to worry about money again. It's kind of a nice deal. That's a really nice deal. Like you have like decades before you even start feeling old, really, and you get to just live off the state. People don't get that as much anymore. They get like, here's your hormone treatment to feel better about yourself because we made you depressed because we treat you like shit. Here's your SSRIs to solve how bad we treat you. Now you don't feel bad, right? Go back to work. And in many ways, the deal gets crueler and more insane. I'm not entirely sure if they won't eventually say, oh, 15 years, we have a guarantee that you'll be given a genetic template child. We'll do it. You know, they have the fake wounds being made now where you can manufacture children in the lab setting, which is kind of disturbing. How do you know in 10 years time they're not going to offer these like 50 to 60-year-old people, oh, we'll take your genes and we'll make a baby for you. You don't even have to get married. That could happen.
Luthemplaer, they already do that, but they're like, hey, what if we put your frozen embryo in a Mexican or Ukrainian woman? How about that? And you just call it surrogacy, and it's fine. Isn't the future grand?
And in many ways, this is like kind of Brave New World territory. That's basically the introduction to it, the opening scenes. But I mean, that system can stretch its diminishing returns out for a century or two. It can. Eventually, it will burn itself out, but it can stretch itself beyond the life expectancy of anyone guilty of these crimes, which is really what it's all about. In some sense, as long as the eunuch feels like it's not the end, as long as they can be convinced it's not the end, they're not going to do too much crazy stuff. If they look out the door and they see a riot coming their way, they're going to like go a little nuts. But we're not at that point yet. Maybe in 2020, that was really what, you know, a lot of us can see that in 2020 something broke in a lot of progressive minds. We're not really sure what it was, but something definitely broke, and they kind of been like really broken since then. There are different things that we could say what caused it, be it like the fear of death from COVID, the fear of death from riots, the fear of this or that. Something fundamentally broke in their brains, and they still haven't gone over it, and they really don't know what to do to get over it. And in some degrees, that was like almost became a eunuchratic class, but it's not quite there yet. But they almost did, and for a brief time period, they were acting like it.
All right. So the next section, and I'm skipping over kind of the scholarly detail, is that you describe a piece you had to work quite hard to find. You know, it's from the New Statesman, I believe, and you essentially dug this out. It was not digitized. So that is, again, its own kind of side story. So I'll go straight into your description of it. And Colin, obviously, is the author. Colin describes the eunuchrat as one disconnected from the needs of the people. Like the eunucrats of China long ago, all they do is go city to city to enforce and debate meaningless bylaws and worthless morals they cook up in their debate clubs, gradually degenerating into a traveling band of robbers as they sense their own irrelevancy. No one actually cares about the eunuchrat's values when inflation is going to the moon and the kids don't have Christmas gifts. Most people are rather more concerned about their national legacy, and eventually the cannibalism of the eunuch is understood as the natural consequence of their impotent officials. A eunocracy is born. While any eunocracy will eventually catabolize itself into a warring states era, Colin describes the on-the-way experience as notable for an absence of disasters, for a lack of success. Things begin to go so bland, Colin points out, that the moment a fuckable candidate starts shaking things up, he wins. He becomes so dangerous that the machine promptly shows itself ready to deal. Now, what dealing involves, either destruction or integrating, depends. To me, that sounds very much like the post-Cold War era. You know? That kind of like nothing ever really happens.
Yeah. Like for about a decade, nothing really happened, and in some places of this country, still nothing happens. You know, the famous meme, "Nothing ever happens." But you know, the second someone like I do consider Trump to be categorically that fuckable candidate that he's writing about. Again, this is written in the 1970s with a lot of this stuff. So he was writing this like 50 years ago, and he basically said like, read the article and the article I sourced. He's basically describing Trump. Like this is a candidate that does fuckable candidate. Trudeau? No, he's not. I mean, he could be.
Sorry, I thought that was just a funny comment. Yeah, I used to just not pay attention to chat at all, but now that I've on a new computer and stuff, I can see it again. And every once in a while, they actually say something funny, and I feel like I have to bring it on.
Yeah, I'll skip over finding this article, but I fell in love with this author. This author about Colin Galashan, I have no idea what happened to him. He just stopped writing in like the late 1970s and disappeared off the radar. There's no Wikipedia article about him. There's no biographies. There's like a single photography book by him. I haven't found anything about this guy, and he's one of the most brilliant writers I've found from the 1970s. I'm trying to find him out more, but like everything he writes is dang near gold. And this is one of the articles I really liked, where he called it the new Eunocracy, which was itself a review of a text from the British Parliament. Now, I can get on this a little bit because we don't have a lot of time left, but essentially in the 1970s, Britain had, as you might know, a massive economic failure. Inflation was 4 times what it was under COVID. It was very bad. Anybody who's lived through the 1970s Britain can tell you how bad it was. It was just a complete shit show. And in that time period, there started Labor was in power, and there was a discussion in Labor about like how can they fix this economic hellscape, because they didn't really know what to do. Britain had never faced inflation like this in the modern era, and there was several meetings in Parliament. Before that meeting happened, one of my favorite politicians who I learned about from this article, Tony Benn. Tony Benn wrote an article, a pamphlet called "The New Politics," and it's kind of a play on words. McGallishan's article here, the new Eunocracy, is a play on the new politics. He's basically calling it out as like you guys are a bunch of stuffy old guys. You're not the heroes you're writing about. And so the new politics described what Tony Benn viewed as the necessary restructuring of government to get something energetic again that won't die, something that won't degenerate into a eunocracy. And McGallishan's article is basically, you are going to become a eunocracy. This is prophecy will happen. Sure enough, it did happen 6 years later. Oh, hello? Test.
One of us dropped out, but I think it was me for a little bit, but you're back.
Okay, sorry. Anyway, though, so just to create a map here, Tony Benn writes his article, The New Politics, outlines how to fix the lack of seriousness people are taking the government. Colin McGallishan writes his article, The New Eunocracy, calling them out as being a unocratic class that can't do anything, and the second anyone fuckable shows up, they're all going to get swept off their feet and destroyed, which did happen. That was Tony Blair several years later. And essentially, let's fast forward to 1976-ish when the economic crisis happens. Tony Benn proposes a radical solution to this problem, trying not to be a eunuchrat. A rather crazy solution, which he calls the alternative economic strategy, but in behind closed doors, he calls it the siege economy.
Can I just?
Yeah.
I want to address this phrase. When the very fuckable Thatcher. That's a phrase that, while I've read, I wish I never had. I don't know how to say this. You have a knack for making me wish I was born blind. I'll put it that way.
Yes. This is called yes. I have a power of pen, and I'd like to make people cringe. That's the old name. That is sarcastic writing, I will say. I'm not gonna get into it, but she wasn't exactly the fuckable candidate.
Anyway, you were saying.
Anyway, yeah. So, in Tony Benn's little meeting, everyone in the Labour government's parliament is saying, let's just take out a loan with the IMF and become America's colony, because that's pretty much the only strategy any of them could see to get out of this destruction. Which, whether or not that was by design is for another time. Tony Benn proposes the siege economy, in which England essentially goes Japan mode. Shut down the economy, close the borders, take control of everything, and gradually redevelop the economy into a modern one that can actually deal with the problems. Tony Benn wanted to try to be the fuckable candidate, and if you look at his photos, he ain't that far off. But ultimately, the parliament goes against him. They kind of oust him out of doing this, and they go with the loan with the Americans and become America's debt slave for the rest of their life to this day. Where am I going with this? There was a time in England where they could have avoided a eunocracy, where they could have avoided the degenerating, self-reinforcing collapse that they're going through to this day, and they chose not to do that because of fear. America is coming close to the point where they'll have to decide: are we going to become a debt slave eunocracy? In some ways, in many ways, the cities already are that. Not all the country is yet, and eventually, America's going to have to decide: are we going to go with the fuckable candidate to save us from this mess, Caesarism, or we're going to go with the old stuffy politicians and their financial games that go nowhere, basically.
Well, in a weird way, I feel like the ultimate eunuchrat is Lindsey Graham.
Yes.
You know, both obviously for the low hanging fruit. You know, the joke writes itself, but also because of this kind of like eternal, like managed decline. You know, like as long as I get mine, you know, like I don't really care. I don't have anything that like matters beyond me in the here and now. And I think that it is, and in many ways you could maybe say like politics kind of got hit by it first, but there is something to be said for the fact that the kind of like the state in which society is pointless. You know, that like no one can really answer the question of like, well, why are we here beyond just, you know, satisfying kind of like the urges of like one mortal generation. And I don't want to rag on the baby boomers endlessly, but there is something about the fact that, look, like even though the baby boomers have had more kids, you know, than many generations after them, they lived like they were the last generation. You know, they burnt through capital. You know, they set up the entire economy to essentially juice their 401ks, juice their home equities. You know, I look like I know enough about finance to know that, you know, that Social Security is just beyond fucked, right? And there is just something to say that, like, look, like, obviously there's this eunuch class we can kind of pick out at. But the greater truth behind it, right? The idea of men without children, men without a legacy, men without something beyond themselves, is I think something that's just become cultural at this point.
Yeah, it's really weird. In many ways, I'm tempted to just tell young men, you're not the generation that gets to pick the pretty girl. You're the generation that gets to pick the competent girl. You didn't win any wars. You didn't earn any valor. You didn't do anything. Your goal was to basically have kids that are better than you with whatever woman's willing to tolerate you. You'll have to find a way to make that work, because you're not going to be the generation that gets the hot girl, and as you get older, you're just going to get more miserable if you don't just get to rebuilding civilization as your primary focus. If you are waiting for the hot girl to build a dynasty with, it's not going to happen. Stop fooling yourself. You're the generation that lost out. Your parents took everything from you, and you're just going to have to build it again. That's the reality that you have to face. And until you start facing it, you're just going to rot away to dust until you face it one day, whether you like it or not.
Well, there's something to this, and I've been thinking about this a lot, right? Because, you know, obviously I was confirmed to be a fake cell, you know, got married. But there is something to, you know, what a repeat guest on my show, Blackhorse, talks about, right? Which is the genetic bottleneck. You know, that we are seeing, and some of it is literal, right? The ending of thousands upon thousands of bloodlines, right? You know, and it's not due to something like a war. It's not due to a plague. It's basically due to lethargy, right? To catabolism, right? What you know, Luthemplaer's talked about. But there is something about it where it's like, look, like, if you make it through, you know, you kind of passed a test, and a pretty big test. And it's not the same test, right, that our ancestors did, you know, which was like, hey, there's a bunch of guys who drink horse blood, and they're going to chop your head off and build a pyramid of skulls and rape your wife. It's not that, right? And it's not, oh no, we're all dying of, you know, Chinese rat disease. now there's suddenly 1/3 less peasants around. But it is sort of like, it's like flypaper, that there is this like ultimate rat poison, that it tastes good and it looks good, and every single neuron in your brain tells you that it's the best thing for you, but it's going to kill you. And it might not literally kill you, but it'll turn you into a eunuch. Sorry, maybe I'm overly philosophizing, but do you see what I'm kind of on about, Luthemplaer?
No, it's true. This is one thing you have to realize is that when we go back a generation when they joked about Skynet taking over, we always imagined it would be nuclear bombs. No one ever thought Skynet would just crash the retirement funds. That's just as destructive. Ultimately, this generation got the short end of the stick. It's time to stop pretending that you can get the long end of the stick. There simply isn't enough there to get that. You should make preparations for how can you establish a family and teach your kids well. This should be your number one priority. Maybe your kids get to do great things. Maybe your kids get to have the hot wife or win the war or build a great monument or do this or the other thing. Great. You'll get to see it from the sidelines. You're not going to be the one that does it. And that's just the reality you have to face as this bottleneck continues to consume your generation. Because it will continue consuming whether or not you like it. And it's not going to stop consuming you. It will continue consuming you until it gets to you. And if you don't have a family, bye-bye. Your line's over and nothing you did mattered. And you have no one to give it to. You were a eunuch, whether you liked it or not. Sorry,
well,
that was dark.
No. I mean, it's interesting, and I don't know if you guys could tell, but I don't even think we covered 20% of this article. Like
it's a long
tends
article.
to do, to essentially write small books, publish them for free on his Substack, about quite literally anything at all. So if that sounds interesting to you, be sure to check out his Substack. It's quite good. It's probably the only Substack where I actually read every post. No offense if you have a Substack, I read at least some of it, I promise. But Luthemplaer's is quite good. It's worth your time. We also have a series of streams together, some on sci-fi, some on his other works. So that's where you can check him out. Also, his Twitter is linked in the description.
I have a new. I recently, the great warlord Elon Musk bequeathed me an old Twitter account, which I have hence rebranded into my AI art posting one for AI. That's American Realms, no space or anything, just American Realms. I just post a lot of art there. That's a lot of AI art there. My main Twitter is mainly just me being an asshole. That's pretty much all there is.
It's truly exhausting, and I want to thank you actually for helping me break my Twitter addiction. Because whenever I'd open that app and see nothing but Bob Chipman and you, it was like, oh jeez, I got to stop.
It's a free service. One of many I provide.
Well, thank you so much for appearing on the show, man. It's good to have you back, and I really do. I miss talking with you, and it's good to be back on the show. As far as my stuff, you guys know where to find me. This show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Odyssey, anywhere you can find podcasts. If you want to support the show, you can do that either by checking out our sponsor, Axios Fitness. Got a new product at a much lower price coming out soon, so keep your heads up for that, especially if you're like me, poor, as they say. There's some new option coming out for you. And if you want to support the show more directly, you can do that at all the normal links down in the description. I do not require it, but I do appreciate it because, you know what? Hosting a podcast is expensive when you pay for the hosting to host 4 episodes a week and only produce 1. That is a bad economic decision, but it's probably the best for my production. Anyway, guys, I appreciate it. I'm glad to be back in the saddle. Lots of good episodes coming up soon. Got the Distributist coming on soon. Philos, who I promised an episode to a long time ago. Other big names you will be happy to see. And anyway, guys, I appreciate it so much. And keep your head up. The lie won't last forever. Good night.